Hello, it's Mr. Esty again, and I'm here for our second bonus video. These bonus videos are a companion to our Introduction to Debate series for ASAP, just inspired by recent current events, the protests about George Ford, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and others. So our first bonus video was about how to cope with debating when the subject gets personal, when the subject feels really powerful to you, you can't disengage. Today, we're going to talk about something that's a little bit more common in regular debate, which is how to defend a position that you hate. Now, I just want to make it clear, I'm not talking about how to defend a position you disagree with. That's a normal part of debate. It's very important to learn how to defend positions that aren't your personal viewpoint. It's important to be able to empathize with people who think differently. It's important to be able to understand opposing points of view. It's important to be able to present the logic of other people. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here are topics that you hate. Topics where one side or the other just feels so wrong to you that you're not sure you can go through the debate. One side seems immoral, dangerous, scary. Possibly this is a resolution that affects you personally, like we talked about in our first bonus video. Or maybe it's a resolution that doesn't necessarily involve you directly, but it goes against your values and beliefs and the causes you've worked for so starkly that you don't think you can go through with it. And that's kind of an abstract point, so let's look at an example. So let's go back to March of 2017. The NSDA published the topic for March of 2017, and it was, I quote, resolved. The United States should no longer pressure Israel to work towards a two-state solution. So, this topic was controversial. Anything dealing with Israel and Palestine these days is controversial. I think the NSDA believed that, in fact, I emailed them, so I know that their official position is this was an important topic. They believe that they wrote a balanced resolution where both sides were debatable, where they gave flexibility to both sides, and that, it's foreign policy. Nobody debating this in the United States is actually in Israel or in a Palestinian territory. So I think they felt like there was enough distance that it was fair game. A lot of my students felt differently. This was a topic that has been bound up in people's identities as Muslims, as Jews, as just citizens of the world. This is a situation where some people in the United States believe that all Palestinians are terrorists, and some people are charging that Israel is committing genocide, and there's not a lot of middle ground between those beliefs. Like this is the kind of topic where people can get really heated, and where, especially if you identify with either Palestinians or Israelis because of your religion or because of your experiences or because maybe you have roots in Palestine or in Israel, maybe you have heritage there, this topic can be really hard to argue. Now, my students in particular were really upset about having to argue the pro side, the side that's arguing that the United States should stop pressuring Israel to work towards a two-state solution. So my students were, their perception was that this resolution was asking them to defend Israel's actions in Gaza and the West Bank, a position that they found indefensible. So I'm going to go through how we dealt with that challenge of finding a way that my students could be comfortable debating the pro as well as the con side of this resolution. And I'm going to show you some of the ways that we interpreted this resolution so that the pro side didn't feel immoral to them. Now, I want to make it clear, these example arguments, we don't necessarily agree with them. You don't necessarily have to find an interpretation of the pro side that you agree with, although you might discover that that's possible. You need to find a version that you don't hate, a version where you don't feel dirty for defending it. And that's usually possible in any well-written debate resolution. You can usually find some version of the pro or con argument that gets around your emotional or moral objections. I want to make it clear that just because I'm bringing up a sample argument here, it doesn't mean that I think that argument is correct or incorrect. I'm just showing you different ways that you can come up with creative arguments by interpreting the resolution in an outside-the-box way. So the first thing you need to do when you get a topic that makes you go, wait, I can't argue that, is to look at that topic carefully, read it carefully, and then do your research. So we have to research this, and I am not going to try to explain all the background of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict here. That is not going to happen in a short video. My co-coach and I both had a lot of expertise on the subject, so we took a couple club sessions to just go through all of the background knowledge. At present, Israel is the preeminent military power in the region. It not only has been able to hold on to its original territory, but it's also periodically occupied territory that's supposed to belong to other countries or to the Palestinians. Currently, Israel occupies the Gaza Strip, which is between Israel and Egypt, and the West Bank, which is between Israel and Jordan. Both of those territories were supposed to eventually become a Palestinian state, an independent country. That's the two-state solution, the idea that you would have a state of Israel, which would be primarily Jewish, and would be the current Israel as we know it now, and then a state of Palestine, which would be primarily Palestinian, primarily Muslim. And there are a lot of reasons why that hasn't happened. There's a lot of reasons why it is very difficult to get that to happen. So when we're looking at this resolution, the reason why a lot of people did not want to debate the pro side is because what they thought they were arguing is that Israel should be allowed to just deny Palestinians a country, to just say, nope, we're taking this land and you don't get to have a country. You don't get any say over it. I will note that at present, in 2020, that's exactly what Israel is doing. Israel is actually annexing parts of Gaza and the West Bank. So that wasn't a ridiculous interpretation of the resolution at all. That is, that's what's going on in the future. So that said, the resolution does not say that the United States should tell Israel to do something. It just says that it should not pressure Israel towards a two-state solution. And that's important. We need to understand, what is this pressure? How does the United States currently pressure Israel to work towards a two-state solution? What is a two-state solution? And we've already talked about what that two-state solution is, but we should note that 2017 was within the first year of the Trump administration, and the Trump administration really hadn't been pressuring Israel to work towards a two-state solution at all. Donald Trump had already moved the U.S. embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, Jerusalem being a city that was supposed to be divided between Israel and Palestine. So putting a U.S. embassy there was sort of a very symbolic gesture to say that they supported Israelis who believed that Israel should own all of Jerusalem, for example. And the U.S. really hadn't been putting any pressure on Israel to, for example, remove settlements from Palestinian land, or remove military checkpoints, or remove blockades. The United States really, under the Obama administration, the United States had been saying things. They've been, paying lip service to the idea. Obama would occasionally make some statement about how it was a shame that Israel was blocking medical supplies from going to Gaza, which was in the middle of a humanitarian crisis. And he really hoped Israel would stop doing that. He didn't do anything to pressure them beyond that, but that brings us to our second main strategy, which is you need to question the underlying assumptions, both your assumptions and the assumptions of the resolution. The resolution is assuming that the United States is or was currently pressuring Israel to work towards a two-state solution. That arguably wasn't the case. I think it was in March of 2017, it would be very hard to argue that the United States was working particularly hard to pressure Israel in any significant way. The United States was pretty much letting Israel do anything it wanted. So that's the first thing. That changes your debating a lot when you can point out that what is this pressure? One argument that you can make in pro is that what's the difference? The United States is already not really pressuring Israel. Let's stop pretending it is. So you want to question those assumptions. There's also the assumption that if you are for the United States, the assumption is that the reason the United States would no longer pressure Israel would be because it wants Israel to take over Gaza and the West Bank, or Israel to stop Palestinian statehood. But that's not what the resolution says. The resolution never says what the U.S. should do instead of pressuring Israel to work towards a two-state solution. It also never says what Israel should do. It only says that the United States should stop pressuring Israel. So that opens up our third technique, which is you want to look at an interpretation of the resolution that you do not hate. Right? You don't want to have to debate against yourself. You don't want to have to debate something that makes you feel icky. Some people can do that, but I think it really puts you at a disadvantage, and it feels bad. But you can usually spin a position you don't like to be at least something that you can connect with in some way. So ways that we did that were to creatively interpret the resolution. And so, for example, we would point out, well, the United States isn't currently really pressuring Israel to work towards a two-state solution. So there's an argument that the United States should, what this should mean is the United States should disengage with Israel. That the United States should just remove itself from the conflict. That you can make an argument that the U.S. involvement in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict makes things worse rather than better. The United States gives billions and billions of dollars to Israel every year in aid, most of it military aid. While Israel has been receiving this aid year after year, it has become one of the preeminent military powers in the world. One of the major reasons, you could argue, that current Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu seems totally uninterested in a peace process or a two-state solution is that Israel has become so powerful militarily that he doesn't really feel like he has anything to lose from an ongoing war. He doesn't really think Palestinians pose much of a threat to Israelis. So that's one argument. Another argument that's similar is simply that the United States has no business being involved. So this is it doesn't help the United States to be involved. Why are we sending billions of dollars of military hardware to Israel? Why are we defending the most hated nation in the world when it really hurts our international standing? So you could make a nationalistic argument and say that the United States' involvement in this conflict is really negative for the U.S. because all of these other countries that hate Israel see the U.S. protecting Israel, and that hatred makes them hate the U.S. as well. And those are just two of the many, many, many possible arguments that our team examined when we were preparing to debate this case. You could argue that the United States needs to shift its goals away from Palestinian statehood and towards other more achievable or more impactful objectives. You could argue, the two-state solution isn't working, and what would be better if we weren't working for that two-state solution is if we focused on getting humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip, or on gaining more citizenship rights for Palestinians, or the right of return for Palestinian refugees. You could argue some sort of one-state solution where Palestinians should automatically get Israeli citizenship. That's not very realistic for reasons, but it's hard to explain that in a debate round. It should be realistic. Uh, you could take on Noam Chomsky's argument of a no-state solution. I don't know that going full-on anarchist is necessarily the best way to win a debate round, but who knows? Especially if you're in a college tournament, you get some college student debate judges. It could be a lot of fun. You can argue that the United States should no longer pressure Israel because the United States should turn that job over to the UN. It's inappropriate for the United States to take personal responsibility unilaterally for this conflict when this is really an international conflict. And why does the US get to be the peace broker when, what gave us the right to insert ourselves as peacekeeper? Especially, you could, as a corollary, argue that the United States is very clearly a biased actor, that the U.S. has shown itself to be extremely favorable towards Israel, far more so than Palestine, and therefore the United States is not an appropriate broker for peace anymore. You could do a lot of things. You could argue that U.S. pressure on Israel is not helpful and that we should just give it up. There's a lot of different arguments you can make that don't bring you all the way to the United States should permit Israel to annex annex the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and do whatever it likes there. You don't have to go there in order to defend the pro. And that's the important thing. Again, I want to remind you that you don't have to agree with any of those topics, either as a debater or as a watcher in this video. The point is that there's a lot of arguments you can make that don't necessarily fall into the moral or emotional traps that seemed inevitable at the start of researching this resolution. You don't have to get stuck at an obstacle. There's usually, in a good debate round, there's usually a way around that obstacle. And that brings us to our last strategy for dealing with topics you hate or positions you hate. And that's that you need to then establish that this is a legitimate interpretation. It's important to note that in public forum, you don't get that much leeway in how you interpret your topics. Public forum, any argument you make has to somehow be tied to the actual words of the resolution. So you can't just interpret the resolution to mean the opposite of what it clearly means. What you need to do is show that your interpretation of the resolution actually makes sense from the exact wording. So for example, if you want to argue that this resolution for pro means that the United States is going to disengage from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the resolution doesn't say that. And so you need to make it clear that the United States disengaging will happen if it stops pressuring Israel, or that the United States really needs to disengage, and that can only happen if it stops pressuring Israel. Now, that second one is kind of obvious, right? Like, you can establish reasons why the United States needs to disengage and then point out, well, if we're pressuring Israel, we're not disengaged. You can also make arguments that right now, The United States is able to engage in the conflict because it's seen as a neutral broker, because it pressures Israel while also helping Israel. If we stop pressuring Israel, then all we're doing is giving aid to Israel, and that means there's no pretense anymore of being neutral. The United States is just an Israeli ally. And that means we don't need to have a seat at the table in the peace process. Those are not ironclad arguments, but you do need something like that that ties your interpretation to the resolution. Now, when you're writing your case, the proper place to make those arguments is in your framework. Remember, when you write a constructive, what we've recommended is that your first speech, your constructive speech, you start with your framework, which includes reading the resolution, defining clearly any terms that you think will be important, and then reading your contentions. Well, there's another potential part of a framework. What a lot of more advanced debaters will do is include observations in their framework. An observation is exactly what it sounds. It's an observation about the resolution, saying like, this is we observed that, and then you explain an implication of the resolution. Like, no, this is not explicitly stated in the resolution, but it is implicitly stated because if the United States stops pressuring Israel to reach a two-state solution, necessarily the only logical thing for it to do after that would be to disengage, for example. And then you give reasons why that is. It's really helpful if you can find a quote from someone involved in foreign policy that explicitly says that. That way you can prove that this is, someone in the United States has actually considered this question. Someone in the US government actually thought about it, and that's what they would do. So just bear in mind that you cannot stretch and bend and twist a debate resolution, at least in public forum. You can't make it mean whatever you want it to mean. You have to stick to the actual words of the resolution. So after you've come up with your interpretation or your angle, that's the time to make sure that you can make that observation that ties it together, and that your observation isn't ridiculous, that your observation will actually hold up against a judge and against a team that's trying to beat it down, and also that the observation doesn't take so long to explain that you lose too much speaking time. Remember, your framework really needs to be 30 seconds long, 45 seconds at the absolute most. So if you can't explain the connection quickly, you need to find a different angle or a different way of linking it. That said, I hope that going through this example has helped you see how much flexibility there really can be even in a public forum topic. And specifically, how even a resolution that looks impossible for you to argue will usually give you an opening to at least not hate the arguments you're making. And that's really important, because if you can't find that opening, then what's happening is your voice is being excluded from this important topic. If my team in March, which is a major championship month in competitive debate, if my team had just skipped March, then they would effectively be locked out of state championships, out of national qualifiers, out of invitationals. And that's a massive equity issue. So it's really important for me as a coach to think about how I can get my debaters not only intellectually prepared, but also how can I get them to engage with topics that are hard for them in a way where they can still win without feeling dirty or hurt or traumatized at the end. Now, I'm not saying that's easy, and I'm not saying I've been perfect at it, but I think it's important for any coach, especially a coach in an urban public school, to think about these issues. And if you're a debater who wants to be a successful competitive debater, who wants to go far into competitive debate, you need to recognize that you will have to eventually confront topics that are really hard for you to argue. And I hope that this video will help you do that more effectively and more comfortably.